we have an esteemed speaker today, and with Professor Jaffrelot doesn't need any introductions. I mean, like those who are the regular reader of Indian Express or the Indian, those who follow Indian news in academia, is an absolutely common name. But for the sake of maintaining certain traditions, I would privilege that and let me introduce Professor Jaffrelot. Professor Christophe Jaffrelot is an it will be sort of an uh, noted political scientist is not exactly the right word, I would say. It's the British is like a rock star political scientist of a contemporary academia. He's a research director of Center for International Studies at Sciences Po at Paris. He's also professor of sociology and Indian politics at King's College London. He's the president of French Political Science Associations. Is currently engaged with multiple research projects on Indian Muslims, on Dargah project, and he has written an excellent sort of PhD thesis. I always say that 1800 pages of PhD thesis on Hindu nationalism. That's fascinating. So he's a visiting professor at numerous global institute like Columbia University, Yale, Princeton, John Hopkins. It's also fascinating to know that he's a recipient of Ramnath Goenka Award for Journalism. I mean, like this is absolutely honor for any academia on working on media and on contemporary Indian politics. His research interest largely on theories of democracy, nationalism, Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, and recently he started working on comparing Israeli science, sociology, Sami Ismuha's concept of ethnic democracy to Indian context. And with this, he has written excellent books on. One is I remember the Indian silent revolutions and on Hindu nationalism, a reader, and then another fascinating co-edited book called Indian Muslims in Indian Cities. He's one of the, without much exaggeration, I would say, he's one of the important. He's an institution in himself. Professor Jaffrelot is an institution. We get regular, constant inspirations from him doing social science research on contemporary South Asia in general and India in particular. Without much delay, I don't want to waste time between you and Professor Jaffrelot. Today's talk is on Indian Muslims today. As you all know, the ambience and the situations and that there is a kahawat in Hindi, "Samazdaro ke liye ishara hi kafi hai." So you know what better situations, what kind of situations right now Indian constitutions and Indian democracy is facing. These will be fascinating sessions for BASE, and I would like to introduce Professor Amjad Hussain, who is a senior professor of English at the Department of English at Alia University, Calcutta. He is a senior professor. His research interest largely on contemporary British poetry, European literature, Indian writing in English, and the process of emergence of cultural modernity and the making of Muslim community in Bengal. He has also written a fascinating book on on Mohsin, Haji Muhammad Mohsin endowment and the progress of education in colonial Bengal. Without much delay, now I would like to request Professor Amjad Hussain to start the proceedings, and then this is over to Professor Hussain.
স্যার আপনি আনমিউট করুন একটু, আপনার মিউট আছে।
Good evening, everybody. I would like to welcome on behalf of Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment all of you to today's lecture. As you have already been introduced to Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, he will deliver today's lecture on the topic, the Indian Muslims today. Now, indeed, it is, I mean, you can all understand that the term Indian Muslims or the Indian Muslims do not constitute a homogeneous group. There is great diversity among the Indian Muslims, but the crisis that they are facing, particularly after 5th August 2020, has made them indeed a homogeneous community. Almost all Indian Muslims are facing the same crisis in the same way, almost, I would venture to say. Indeed, it is almost a kind of existential crisis for the Indian Muslims. It seems that all of the institutions of India are failing them. So we do not know which way to go, where to look for sustenance and comfort. And therefore, in this crisis, I think Professor Christophe Jaffrelot will provide us some insights regarding the way forward and what will be the role of Indian Muslims, particularly in future, in India's plural, secular, inclusive, democratic setup. I don't know how long, particularly this inclusive democracy, pluralistic society of India will survive. It is indeed a moment of great trauma for all Indian Muslims. So we look forward to hearing from Professor Christophe Jaffrelot. I hope he will give us some at least deep insights into the present situation, as well as I said, the way forward. Over to Professor Christophe Jaffrelot.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation and for your kind words, sir. And a special thank you to Abdul Mateen, who was very much instrumental in making this virtual meeting, possible. What I'm going to present now is based on some of the work I'm doing at the moment with colleagues, and I'll mention the contribution of other colleagues in the course of this presentation. I'm collecting data all the time. That's how I proceed. And I try to base my interpretations on the largest number of facts. And facts in social sciences are not so easy to gather when you deal with contemporary India. More and more we have to build our own data sets. And that's what I'm going to present to a certain extent, the making of data sets, of databases, which come as supplements to what others do. Journalists who are, when they do investigative journalism, very good at, enumerating and reporting on violence, on riots, on ghettoization processes. I'm going to focus more because of the data I have gathered on other processes, which will be much more socioeconomic and political. So the research question, the main research question I'm going to try to answer is about the idea that Muslims had been pampered, quote unquote, by the Congress system. Now, this idea has gained momentum after the Shabano case in the mid-1980s. I think it's very important to return to the data and see to what extent, socioeconomically as well as politically, Muslims had benefited from a treatment of favor, if you want. And to do justice to that question, I will present a large number of tables and graphs and figures. But the second research question that I'm interested in is, of course, related to the new dispensation. And therefore, the question becomes, what kind of difference has the rise to power of BJP made for Muslims in India? And I will continue to look at the same kind of data in the second part of this presentation, dealing with this second research question, socioeconomic data, as well as political data. Well, to do that, I will look at some state level information. But this is clearly one of the weaknesses of my presentation today. It's much more, it's too aggregated. It needs to be disaggregated. And I'm sure in the Q&A, when we will have a conversation, we will be in a position to look at differences. And West Bengal is definitely different in that respect, so far as the Muslim situation is concerned. So I will leave that for the Q&A, but you will see some tables giving some idea of how contrasted the situation of Muslims in India sometimes is, according to some indicators. So let's begin with this first question. How pampered have Muslims been during the Congress rule under so many decades of Congress government or Congress-led coalitions? Well, one interesting entry point there has to do with the linguistic policy. Urdu had been recognized as an official language, as one of India's official languages, in spite of some opposition during the Constituent Assembly debates. But Urdu has clearly been a collateral casualty of the policies followed by Congress governments in North Indian states. Now, North Indian states, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, have most of the time in the 50s, 60s, maybe even 70s in some cases, been governed by Hindu traditionalists, to use a phrase my mentor, Bruce Graham, has coined to designate, you can say, right-wing leaders of the Congress. Shukla in Madhya Pradesh, well, the list is long, I don't want to give too many names. These leaders have not defended very actively, to such an extent that the central government had to investigate, had to appoint commissions for seeing why was Urdu lagging behind. Well, the teaching was not there, the budgets was not there, were not there at the state level. And therefore you have this clear trend that the Census of India every 10 years showed that the percentage of Urdu speakers declined when the percentage of Muslims increased in Uttar Pradesh, where the gap is now beyond 10 percentage points, but also in Bihar, where you have also a significant gap between the percentage of Urdu speakers and the percentage of Muslims in the state. And as a result, somewhat paradoxically, Urdu has become a South Indian language, with Andhra Pradesh being one of the states where the percentage of Muslims and the percentage of Urdu speakers are very close. And this map of the percentage of Urdu-speaking Muslims shows how paradoxical the situation has become indeed, with Urdu that was born in North India becoming more and more a South Indian language for the Muslims. So that's one interesting test of this idea that Muslims were pampered in the sense that their language has not been defended in states which have been governed by Congress for decades. Also, an interesting point, where were Muslims in the state apparatus? It took me quite some time to build this data set with one of my students Shweta. But we did it finally, and we got an idea of the percentage of Muslims among the IPS officers between 1951 and 2016. And what you see there is that never, almost never, had Muslims represented more than 4% of the IPS officers. And of course, the gap increased vis-a-vis their percentage in the Indian population, because the percentage of Muslims in the Indian population increased when the percentage of Muslims within the IPS officers stagnated. The situation is even much more disturbing if you remove Jammu and Kashmir from the data set, because in Jammu and Kashmir, of course, police officers are Muslims. Well, the situation is almost similar in the IAS, among the IAS officers. If Muslims had been pampered, they would have certainly been overrepresented among IAS officers, even if they had not been able to qualify. If you really promote a group, you can promote people who are not competent from this group as well. Well, competent or not competent, the question does not rise, because what we see there is that the percentage of Muslims among the IAS officers varied a lot between 78 and 2016, but again, almost never had the Muslims represented more than 5% of the IAS officers. So the underrepresentation of Muslims among this elite group has been a constant, with ups and downs, of course. Now let's turn to what has been a major contribution of the Satra Committee report. The Satra Committee report has been the first document that has paid a lot of attention to the kind of jobs Muslims were doing. And this is something based on the data which were available at that time. They covered the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. What this showed in the Satra Committee report was that only 8% of urban Muslims belong to the salariate, when the national average is 21%. Most of Muslims, 61% of them, were self-employed as peasants, artisans, traders, and that was much more than the Hindus. This table gives an even more precise picture of the situation of the Muslims. It's not only that they are not very well represented among the salaried people, they are particularly excluded from the public sector. 0.05% of Muslims are part of the regular salaried non-agricultural sector, against almost 20% for the Hindus. This gap is very interesting because it stands in contrast with the presence of Muslims in the private sector. In the private sector, 19.70% of Muslims are part of the salariate, which means that there is hardly any disconnect with the situations of the Hindus, who are 22.16%. The private sector does not discriminate as much as the public sector. And that's another indication that the government had not pampered the Muslims. On the contrary, Muslims have been excluded from the salaried jobs offered by the public sector. And that's why they were mostly in the informal sector. And you can see that the informal figures, the figures pertaining to the informal sector, show that Muslims are always more represented there than Hindus. When they joined the public sector, and they did sometimes, some of them did, as you could see, a small minority, but this small minority is very interesting because we see there, that's again the Central Committee report, that their share was particularly small in the railways, in the PSUs, at the university level, among teachers as well as non-teaching personnel of the universities. So you can disaggregate the figure showing that Muslims are underrepresented among the salaried people in the public sector and see that it's particularly true in some key places, including railways, PSUs, and universities. Another interesting data that we found in the Sachar Committee report, and that comes from the NSS National Sample Survey, is that in terms of wages, for the same kind of work, the Muslim OBCs, and you know that among Muslims, OBCs are also Muslim Dalits, are less paid than their equivalent, those who also benefit from reservations among the Hindus. And that's true as well in the public and in the private sector. Let's turn to education, because that is key. And I'll return to it in my conclusion, by the way, because it is indeed the key. Well, Muslims, if we go by the census of India, lag behind all the other religious categories in terms of education. These are the 2001 census results. The last one is not so bad, but still the gap is still there. And this gap is important to explain. Incidentally, it's not due to Muslim women. The Muslim woman education rate, literacy rate, it is not very much below the Hindu rate for women, 50% against 53%. It's more because of the gap that you see on the male side that makes the Muslims lagging behind by far. 59.1% of Muslims were literate in 2001 against 65.1% of Hindus. This is something that has been explained by the dropout rate that you can see on this table, also coming from the Sachar Committee report. Up to the primary level, Muslims send their kids to school more than any other community, 65.31% against 54.91% for Hindus. But as early as the middle, and even more clearly at the secondary and senior secondary levels, there is a dropout rate that gradually but inexorably make the Muslims the last. Only 4.53% of Muslim boys and girls are in the senior secondary schools. And of course, in terms of graduation, we have a disastrous result with only 3.6% of Muslims graduating. That's a figure I will revisit because my conclusion will be on this, and I'll have more recent figures to present. But this is, I repeat, a way to show that under the Congress rule and the Sachar Committee report, was, of course, reviewing what had taken place in the previous decades, mostly when India was ruled by Congress. You don't see Muslims pampered in any way, be it in the education system or elsewhere. As a result, the kind of education the young Muslims got compared to the kind of education their parents and grandparents got, you see that they are the only ones who have lost ground in a rather steady manner from the mid-60s onward. And that's a reflection of what I've just shown before. As a result, and I'll end the first part of my presentation with this, as a result, we have a percentage of Muslims living below the poverty line that is quite substantial, but also quite original, so to speak, atypical. In most of the cases, for most of the communities, the percentage of people living below the poverty line is higher in villages than in towns and cities. Muslims are the only ones with the Sikh people, but the Sikh people, it's because, of course, they are so rich farmers in Punjab that the percentage is also atypical. But if you remove the Sikh from this table, you see that Muslims are the only ones where there are more poor people in urban Indian urban context than in rural context. And that's why we did the book you mentioned in the introduction when you referred to some of my books. We did this book on Muslims in Indian cities precisely to understand why was it so? Why were Muslims so poor in so many Indian cities? And we have no time to enter into this, but the book explains that there is a specific pattern of ghettoization among Indian Muslims in many Indian cities. So we can disaggregate urban and rural. We can also aggregate and see what has been the per capita mean income of Muslims vis-a-vis others in the last few years. And this is a very interesting graph that has been made by my colleague, Kelai on these questions. He showed on the basis on NSS surveys, on the basis of the India Human Development Surveys, that Muslims used to have a per capita mean income that was above the Dalits and not far behind the Hindu OBCs till 2005, 2004, 2005. But in 2011, 2012, Muslims are now the last ones in terms of per capita mean income. So that's what, as I say, the Indian Human Development Survey presented as an aggregate.
Professor, please unmute yourself, someone.
Professor, please unmute your audio.
No voice.
Professor Jaffrelot, please unmute. Yes,
Sorry,
yes,
can you hear me now?
yes, yes.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened. So let me return to.
Please again. Yes, yes. Present it, but can't see the PPT. Yes, yes,
Can you?
yes, yes,
You
yes,
can see it now.
yes, sir.
Okay.
Do it
So
full
I
screen.
was. Okay.
Yes, fine.
All right. So what I was doing, what I was about to do to conclude on this first part, um, I need to disaggregate this big statistical finding showing that Muslims lag behind every group, including Hindu Dalits. Well, it's true. It's more true in some states. For instance, in Haryana, the Muslims' capital annual income represents only 68% of the per capita annual income of Dalits. In Gujarat, 69%. In West Bengal, 79%. In Kerala, 82%. In Maharashtra, 87%. So there are only few states, including Karnataka, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, where the per capita annual income of Muslims is above those of the Hindu Dalits. That's somewhat counterintuitive to some extent, and I think it deserves more research for understanding these local situations. Similarly, as you said in the introduction, Muslims are not at all homogeneous. And to be a poor Muslim in Kerala is not the same thing as being a poor Muslim in Gujarat or in Bengal. Just to give you an idea, the annual per capita income of Muslims lag behind Kerala, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Gujarat, West Bengal, Haryana. So you may not be as poor as Dalits when you're a Muslim in Uttar Pradesh, but you are still very poor compared to a Muslim who lives in Kerala or Maharashtra. So that's something, of course, we can return to in the conversation. But I wanted to disaggregate the big statistical findings because, as you see, it's a very complex picture. And we use this data with Kalai Yarasan in an op-ed that you may return to. The reference is available on this slide. Now, second research question. What difference has the rise to power of BJP made in socioeconomic and political terms for the Muslims? And I will focus on two dimensions. There are many others. But to be consistent with my first part, I will look at statistics, at data. And I will first look at the way Muslims have been marginalized in assemblies. I will look at the way Muslims feel discriminated against by the police in many different states. Well, this piece of information first. Since 1980, the percentage of Muslims in the Lok Sabha has almost constantly declined. There are few ups and downs, but the trend is very clear. There were 49 Muslim MPs in the Lok Sabha in 1980, and therefore they represented 9% of the seats in 1980. At that time, you may remember, Muslims represented 11% of the Indian population. So they were 11% in society and they were 9% in the Lok Sabha. The gap was only 2 percentage points. The decline reached the lowest point in 2014 when BJP won a majority of the seats. And for the first time, the percentage of Muslims in the Lok Sabha was below 4%. Less than half of what it was in 1980. And of course, one of the main reasons why it was so was because there was no Muslim MP on the BJP side. For the first time, the ruling party, the winner of the election, had not even one Muslim MP on its side. There was a slight recovery last year during the last Lok Sabha elections. The number of Muslim MPs jumped from 21 to 25, but still the percentage of Muslim MPs is below 5%. And this is something we have studied in detail with my colleague Gilles Verniers from Ashoka University, from the Trivedi Center for Political Data, because we are co-directing a program called the SPINPER Social Profile of India's national and provincial elected representatives, which is scrutinizing the social profile of the MPs and the MLAs. And the MLAs, let me turn to the MLAs to save time. The MLAs offer a very interesting reconfirmation, interesting and disturbing reconfirmation of what we have just seen. What is true at the Lok Sabha level is almost equally true at the state assemblies level. If you look at you can always contrast them with the figures in yellow. Gujarat, a state where Muslims represent 9.1% of the population. Only 1.6% of the MLAs are Muslim, and they were only 1% in the previous state assembly. They used to be 6% in the early 80s. Karnataka, a state where Muslims are 12.2% of the population. The MLAs, the Muslim MLAs there are only 3.1%, and they were only 2.7% in the previous assembly. In the late 70s, they were more than 7%. Madhya Pradesh, a state where you have 6.4% of Muslims, only 0.4% of the MLAs, I think it's only one individual, in fact, there is only one Muslim MLA in Madhya Pradesh, come from the Muslim community. They were 2.7% in the late 60s, early 70s. Maharashtra, a state where there are more than 10% of Muslims, only 3.1% of the MLAs are Muslims. They used to be 9% in the mid-80s. Orissa, a state where there are only 2% of Muslim in the population, only 0.7% of the MLAs are Muslim. They were 2.7% in the mid-80s. Rajasthan, 1% of the MLAs only are Muslim. They used to be 5% in the early 80s. Uttar Pradesh is, of course, the most interesting case because till BJP won in 2017, because of the Samajwadi Party and also the BSP, the percentage of Muslim MLAs was very high, something like 17%, almost 17%, 16.9%, when there were 18.5% of Muslims in Uttar Pradesh. So the percentage of Muslims in society, in the state and in the assembly was almost the same. That dropped when the BJP took over, and only 5.6% of the MLAs of Uttar Pradesh are Muslims today. The only exception to this trend is West Bengal. Because in West Bengal, the percentage of Muslim MLAs is about 20. It's not far behind the percentage of Muslims in society, 25.2%. And it's much more. For instance, in 85, you had only 2.9% of MLAs who were Muslim. So of course, the rise to power of Trinamool Congress is explaining this trend, this completely atypical trend. West Bengal is the only state where the percentage of Muslim MLAs is increasing. Everywhere else, like in the Lok Sabha, you see a marginalization of Muslims in terms of political representation. And that's, I think, the most obvious impact that the rise to power of BJP has represented for the Muslim minority. The other impact that I'd like to focus upon is something I drew from a report, a survey made by Common Cause and the CSDS in 2019, last year. They had found that the police was seen by Muslims as biased. In fact, the percentage of Muslims thinking that the police was very much or somewhat hostile was very high. In fact, these people were fearful of the police more than any other groups. Dalits came after that, and to a great extent. How do we explain this? In fact, when Muslims who say we are fearful of the police are asked why, they usually say because police often implicates Muslims under false terrorism charges. And indeed, there are many cases of young Muslims who have been to jail and who have sometimes even spent years in jail for this reason, quote unquote. You know, they were suspected of being implicated in terrorism activities. And that's one of the reasons why the percentage of Muslims in the Indian jails, in fact, is so high. The last figure the National Crime Bureau gave in 2015 was 21%. 21% of the inmates an overrepresentation of Muslims compared to the percentage they represent in society, only 14.5%. This overrepresentation is somewhat proportionate to the overrepresentation of the blacks in the Indian jail, in the American jails. What I find even more interesting is that when you look at those who have been sentenced and who are in jail because they have been sentenced, not waiting for their trial, then the percentage of Muslims dropped to 15.8%. That is almost proportionate to the population of Muslims in society, which means that indeed many Muslims have gone to jail because the police suspected wrongly that they were implicated in some crime. And when the judiciary could look at the files, then they were made free. That's certainly another development, a recent development that goes with the new dispensation in Indian politics. So I also assume that this is a reflection of one of the slides I've shown before. The percentage of Muslims in the Indian police is very small, and it doesn't help. But I don't want to elaborate too much on this. I'm sure you get my point. So to conclude, and I've been too long already, so let me just recap what statistical information regarding the education and the socioeconomic status of the Muslims show is that this minority has not been pampered by Congress after 47. If it had, we would have had a different socioeconomic profile, a different political profile as well. So the data that I have used, including those pertaining to the growing underrepresentation of Muslims in the Lok Sabha and the state assemblies, shows that in fact, the Muslim situation has deteriorated since the 90s and 2000s, but even more in the subsequent years, in parallel, of course, to the rise of BJP that has not nominated candidates, Muslim candidates, in large numbers at the time of election. What will be the next challenges? Well, in the short term, of course, it's already generated many agitations. We will see this as a problem also because Muslims are among the categories, the social categories, along with scheduled caste and OBCs and STs, for where you don't find birth certificate of children under 5. To prove the citizenship will be hard, and the CA therefore is certainly a challenge. It's primarily a challenge in Assam, but it may be a challenge elsewhere, for sure. We'll see what the international community will say about it. For the first time in February this year, the UN has reacted to the transformation of the rules to access Indian citizenship. Whether that will make an impact or not remains to be seen. That's the short-term challenge. In the mid-term, I really think that education is a major challenge. And I want to return to this because we are working hard on this with Kalai Arasan. We have published another op-ed on this a few months ago in the Express. We could have access to the last NSS National Sample Survey, the one that has not been released officially because it was supposed to be unreliable. Well, the statisticians who have made it consider that it is reliable. It has been made like the previous ones, so you can use this survey like the previous ones. And what you see there is that the proportion of the youth who have completed graduation among Muslims in 2017-2018 is only 14%, as against 18% for the Dalits, 25% for the OBCs, for the Hindu OBCs, and 37% among the Hindu upper caste. So the gap between the SCs and Muslims is only 4 percentage points. It is now 4 percentage points. It was 6 years before in favor of the Muslims. So I don't want to repeat all the data, all the statistical data that are there, but my hunch is that what is shrinking more quickly here is an elite, and a community needs some elite. The elite group of educated Muslims is shrinking very quickly. And I think in the midterm and in the long term, that will be definitely a major challenge that needs to be thought about now, because it's now that you can somewhat change the course of history, the trajectory of the community. And I think you are better placed than anybody to take care of this major issue. And I stop here in order to conversation. The data that I have just mentioned are documented, illustrated by graphs which are always showing the same thing. Just a word about this one. 31% of Muslims who are between 15 and 24 are neither in education nor in jobs. That's more than any other group, and that's exactly the problem I was emphasizing. It's almost 1/3 of the Muslim youth that is jobless and without access to higher education. Can you hear me now? Okay, so I can stop my PowerPoint if you don't mind. Is it fine if I leave it like that, or do you want me to?
Well, we'll have round of question answer. That would be, I guess,
okay,
more
but can you see me, or yeah, all right.
Yeah,
all right.
We can see you. Yeah. Yeah, Professor Hussain, please.
I think you should unmute.
Sir, unmute করুন.
Your phone is, your mic is not on.
Okay. Yes, now. So as you see, Professor Christophe Jaffrelot has delivered an absorbing lecture. He has produced statistics from various sources to indicate the condition of the Muslims, the Indian Muslims, in the education sector, in the job sector, in both private and public sector, in police, in IAS, and I think in political, yes, in the political scenario, the number of the percentage of Muslim MPs and Muslim MLAs in the state legislatures are very, very poor, and indeed declining rather. So by showing, presenting a lot of statistics, he has convincingly shown that the common accusation that we often make, that the Muslims were pampered by the previous Congress governments in the country, is not true at all. And rather, it is also true that after the coming to power of the BJP, the conditions of the Muslims are declining in almost in every sphere, not only just in the number of MLAs or MPs, but in other respects also. Now, he has also spoken about the challenges which in the short term we have to face, the challenge of the new Citizenship Amendment Act. He has referred to the UN UN comments regarding this, but we don't know whether the present dispensation in the center will at all pay attention to that. So it will be indeed a great challenge in the short term. He has also spoken about the long-term challenges, mid-term, long-term challenges. The percentage of Indian Muslims in the education field is indeed very poor. It is rather declining. It is now even less than the OBCs, Hindu OBCs, and far less than the Hindu upper castes. So you see the elite group, as he pointed out, elites among the Muslims are shrinking in the university sector, in IS, in other fields, even among the research areas. That is not improving at all. So it is a midterm as well as a long-term challenge for the Indian Muslims. We have to work hard on increasing the number of Indian Muslims in the upper echelons of power and education. This is what he has suggested, and the Q&A session now start. I would like to welcome, invite questions from the participants, from the listeners.
Professor Jaffrelot, I have one small question. I take the privilege of asking questions. Why don't you think that India is not an ethnic democracy? I mean, like, I have gone through your latest articles on India becoming, there are a lot of points. India is fulfilling those points. What are the points still remaining in achieving the idea of ethnic democracy?
Well, this notion of ethnic democracy comes from an Israeli social scientist, Sami Smuha, who defines this ethnic democracy, if you want, in a bracket, as a place where some citizens are more equal than others. And I like to paraphrase George Orwell there, because it shows that there is, in practice, some difference that is not acknowledged in principle. In principle, everybody is equal. In practice, there are second-class citizens which belong to the minority. In fact, ethnic democracy is another word for majoritarianism. We see this in many democracies. And I mentioned the US just a while ago. Here is a democracy where clearly the blacks have not been recognized as full-fledged citizens. And the way they are overrepresented in jail, the way they are treated by the police is a reconfirmation of that. India is going in this direction. And in contrast to what we see in Israel, it's not de jure, it's not written in the constitution. Israel is the state of the Jews. That's in the constitution. India has a secular constitution where de jure everybody is equal. But de facto you see this kind of segregation, discrimination, marginalization, you may say exclusion. So I've used the data of the state assemblies and Lok Sabha to show this process. Very few mainstream parties are prepared to give tickets to Muslims today. But I could use other indicators. Ghettoization is a very interesting, so to speak, indicator. It's more and more difficult to find a place in a mixed neighborhood for some Muslims. And in some states, it's not only de facto, it's de jure. Gujarat, in some cities, including Ahmedabad and Baroda, one of my friends, Sharik Laliwala, is working on this very effectively. In some of these cities, you cannot sell your house to someone from a different community. So ghettoization is not only de facto, it's also de jure. But most of the problems are de facto. The laws have not changed, but the practice of the people has changed. So that's why I use the concept of ethnic democracy like you see it in the place where it has been invented, Israel. But I say India is a de facto ethnic democracy, not a de jure ethnic democracy. Yeah.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah. Please.
Thank you for the enlightening lecture. My question is in regards to Indian politics. Do you think that the rise of Muslim politics, not to a large extent, but there has been a visibility of the rise in the form of MIM and one Muslim political party in Northeast India by the name of All India United Democratic Front? Has the rise of these parties or the space given to them backfired against Muslims, and which has resulted in less number of public representatives in both parliament and the state assemblies?
Yeah, this is an excellent question, and it's one of the topics on which I'm going to work, because that's a new development. We saw it, for instance, in Maharashtra during the last state elections, when we saw Owaisi and Prakash Ambedkar joining hands to fight not only Shiv Sena and BJP, but also NCP in Congress. And you can argue that in Maharashtra, this alliance between Owaisi and Prakash Ambedkar had resulted in the loss of few states. People say 22 to 25 states for the NCP and the Congress. So here is the problem. Muslims do not consider that Congress represents them well. But if they shift to Muslim parties, then they will further weaken Congress. That's the dilemma. And this dilemma can only be solved if you look at the situation at the state level and even at the constituency level, and realize that your priority has to be clear. If your priority is to make the BJP candidate be defeated, then you have to find out who is the stronger candidate. And it may not be the Muslim party candidate.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks for your enlightening series with lots of data and insight. I am working on this journal. I'm not sure if you have heard about this journal that started in 80s, known as Muslim India by Syed Shahabuddin, a very controversial figure. I'm taking you back in time for a reason. He is known for controversial remarks and much more controversial figures because of his involvement in Babri Masjid, Shah Banu, and the banning of Islamic verses. I started my research due to realizing his image and his controversial remarks. But once I have researched on his journal, I found most of the points that you have made, he had of exclusion, systematic exclusion of Muslims from political, economic domain. He has been making those points since 80s, in the starting of 80s, but ended up being a very controversial and a fundamentalist image, ended up with that. Do you see this kind of exclusion and the binaries that political leaders that we have to cater to, even those are available as MPs to us, some of them has to cater to these boundaries of good or liberal secular Muslims, or those who speaks up ends up with this certain kind of image, certain kind of images like Syed Shahabuddin has suffered in the till now? Thank you.
Sorry, I could not follow the whole question because there were many cuts, but I got the idea. Of course, I know Muslim India, and I was one of the readers of this publication till it stopped. But my response would be: you don't need to be controversial, and you will not be controversial if you defend the Indian Constitution. To go by the Constitution is the best shelter, for everybody and for minorities in particular. Minorities can look at themselves as citizens and therefore remove the tag of minorityism by fighting for the respect of the Constitution. That's the point I always make. You don't need to fight as a Muslim. You can fight as an Indian citizen, fighting for the Constitution, and that is the best legitimacy you may get. Incidentally, that's what Ovaisi is saying more and more too. And how can that be controversial?
Thank you, Professor. I have a request. Please, no one ask a question out of turn. If you have any question, please write your name there, write the question there in the chat box, and then I'll call out the name. Then only, please don't ask question out of turn. Shariar Alam, please go on. Shariar Alam.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, sir, for your enlightenment and your talk. I want just to ask a small question, whether today in the political spectrum, we are the Indian.
I can't hear you anymore.
Okay, I'm repeating his question. So he is basically asking, do you think Muslims are caught between being ideal Muslim and patriotic, basically good Muslim, bad Muslim dilemma?
So I'm just trying to say that if we being a good Muslim, we are termed as radical elements or fundamentalists, or we either have to support patriotism.
Yeah, we got your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So
well, I don't know I don't know what you mean by good Muslim. The thing is, the risk is that Muslims would be squeezed between fundamentalists who would ask them to return to the basic tenets of the Sharia and so on. And of course, some Middle Eastern countries may play a role there. They may be squeezed between these and those who will consider that they have not become mainstream enough. They have not merged sufficiently with the dominant ethos and lifestyle. Well, the only response for me here is multiculturalism is enshrined in the Indian Constitution. Secularism has never been irreligious. Each religion is on a par, officially recognized. And last but not least, the way Islam developed in India is different. It's different from the way it developed in the Middle East. It's different from the way it developed in Saudi Arabia, for sure. And therefore, the Muslim identity that has to be defended is the one that has been inherited from the legacy of worldly worship by Hindus. And if you go to Ajmer and visit Dargah Sharif, that is still very true. So to be a good Muslim in that sense is to be a good Indian. And you can, again, find in the constitution the support you need for being recognized as such and for rebuking those who will tell that the best Muslims are not in India but in the Middle East. They are not. They are just different.
Thank you. Because you are referring to constitution time and again, Nasima Islam has a question. But sir, the current dispensation is hell-bent on changing the constitution itself. Some of the recent developments prove that. What's your stand on this? And after this, Parvez Alam from Aligarh, please be ready.
Yeah, no, but this is exactly the risk I mentioned when I spoke about the CAA. The CAA is, for the first time, an attempt at changing not only de facto India, but de jure India. So to fight for the constitution is definitely the only battle that can be legitimate, and that has to be a priority. Sure, that's the next step for sure.
Yeah, hello, Professor. I have a question.
Yeah, Parvez Alam.
Parvez, yeah.
Please don't speak out of turn. Please wait for your turn. Parvez Alam from Aligarh.
Yes. Good evening, Professor. Well, it was really insightful lecture. I have a two set of questions. Number one, I mean, this is a rather liberal paranoia in India, particularly, that Muslims are burdened by, this narrative that they have to become citizen and they have to respect constitution. On one hand, you have, militant Hinduism, as you have worked and we have got from your insights only, and and Muslims have not resorted back with that militant, say, Muslimism or something like that, a militant Islam, particularly at least in Indian subcontinent. So, I mean, how do you see that? I mean, Indian Muslims being only, respecting the constitution, and whenever they are asserting their identity, they are dubbed as either conservative or fundamentalist. Second set of, one question is that, do you think some kind of what you call? I mean, we can just sort of work out with ethnic democracy and consociational democracy, that what Leifert comes up with, particularly that Lebanese model where you have, representation on proportion basis. Thank you.
Yeah, no, the question of the type of regime that is the best for India is arising again. Consociative democracy would mean that Muslims are constituted into a separate political force. And it's very difficult to achieve this. I mean, it's even impossible to achieve this at the moment. And I think one of the reasons is that because of partition, the idea that a Muslim party representing the Muslims of India is almost anathema. So I would not go in this direction. I would not push for this kind of transformation of the regime. I would stick to the secular ethos of traditional India. That is the identity that I was referring to when I spoke about Sufism and so on. And secondly, I would stick to the constitution. That is not consociative. That is a liberal democracy. So that's the strongest base for fighting in the name of your rights. But so consociative democracy would I think take you nowhere.
Thank you. So while I go to the next question, I also have a question. So towards the end of
I can't hear you.
Riyaz just left. There's some technical issue.
Who is next in the line? Like,
Yes, let me see it.
May I ask my question?
Yes, please ask. You are asking.
Yeah, Professor, my question is that in the end of your lecture, you said that you see shrinkage of the Muslim elite. So I just want to know, how do you see that, the shrinkage of the Muslim elite?
Can you repeat? I could not hear the beginning.
You said in the end of your lecture that you have noticed the shrinkage of elites among the Muslims in India. So I just want to know, how do you see this shrinkage?
Well, you see it if you look at the statistical data coming from the NSS. There is a clear reduction of the proportion of Muslims among graduates, and it's a linear trend. I don't know how to explain that. It's a work in progress. With some colleagues, we will investigate. Is it because of discrimination? Is it because of self-censorship? Maybe self-censorship can be explained because why should you study if you do not get jobs that are really in relation with your studies? I don't know. But that's very disturbing because I don't know any community in a position to resist if there is no elite, if there is no group educated and trained in such a way that they can defend the values, the interest of this elite. That's the only remark I can make, but I'm working on it because I find it particularly interesting and completely counterintuitive. You know, one last point. This is exactly the reason why we need positive discrimination for Muslims. Precisely because in the case of Dalits, it had worked. Dalits have now a middle class, you can say even a bourgeoisie, because of reservations. And Muslims are losing to the Dalits to such a way that for Mishra, the only way out, the only solution was to have some quota system for the Muslims as well. Now we all know that it is completely impossible. There'll be never religion-based quotas in India. So what are the alternatives? You can use socioeconomic criteria for justifying some positive discrimination, but that has to be thought about because I repeat, if there is no elite left, the sense of direction for the community may be lost easily.
Professor, my question to you.
Here, Chitarji, please unmute and ask your question.
Yes. Good evening, Professor, and thank you for an extremely insightful talk. My question for you is that the idea that Muslims have been appeased in India, the people who believe in this idea also believe that the implementation of the Uniform Civil Code would probably bring about a change. But there is also the threat that the Uniform Civil Code would only uphold the majoritarian ideals. And as you were saying, it would probably push towards making India a de facto ethnic democracy more and more.
So what is your opinion regarding this? Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, after the CA, that is probably one of the reforms that will be proposed by the government. Gradually, we see the old pillars of the BJP's agenda implemented. So that is bound to happen after Jammu and Kashmir, after Ayodhya. The third priorities, the third priority that they had since the 90s is uniform civil code. Well, on that front, I think the best attitude would be to show some openness vis-a-vis reform, but some reforms that should be for everybody. Why should only minorities reform their practices? And therefore, I think of the Hindu reform that has been implemented, introduced in the 50s and 60s, because that would make every citizen of India on a par. If it has to be universalistic, if equality between men and women has to be the rule of the game, it should be for everybody. So instead of resisting in a rather closed-minded manner and a conservative manner, I think to be open to reforms that everybody should benefit from would be a great attitude.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. What about presenting Muslim case in international court to get our rights when it is being denied by Indian Constitutional Court?
Well, that may happen, but that is far-fetched. If you want to look at some internationalization of the Muslim question, I think the steps which have been taken already are to be followed closely. On the UN side, you have, as I have mentioned, Mrs. Bachelet looking at it, and it's not a court, it's a UN commission.
Professor, just unmute your audio. Someone muted you.
Sorry, I don't know why it was muted. Yeah. So I was just repeating that Mrs. Bachelet, the UN Human Rights Commission person, is certainly more easily approachable than any court. That's a much more realistic step, and it has been taken already. The other thing is, of course, foreign countries are watching. And the US Congress has started to study every year what kind of freedom of religion was available in India. And the report that is made to the Congress is every year more disturbing. So never underestimate the role of the Congress in the American democracy. The president is not the only power center, far from that. And then you have the European Union, especially the European Parliament, following what's going on in India very closely. And last but not least, Muslim countries. Muslim countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, very, very interestingly, Narendra Modi has tried to get closer to these countries. And one of the objectives was certainly to do more business, to get more investment, and also to somewhat divide Pakistan from these countries. Now, that is something that is somewhat boomeranging. And we've seen the UAE, we've seen the IOC protesting against the way the Jammu and Kashmir issue had been dealt with. So if you think in terms of internationalization of the question, instead of going to the court directly and primarily, I think there are many other entry points, and some of them are already active. Some of them are already in the process of reporting on India in their own countries. By the way, the international media is also very, very active, and the New York Times, Washington Post, The Economist, they do a great job.
Okay, there is a next question. Professor A.T. Khan, former Vice Chancellor of Alia University. How is your presented data reliable? How did you collect it, and how much time did you spend for it?
Decades is the response. It's a full-time job. Most of the data are secondary sources based. So I always cite the data, Census of India, NSS, India Human Rights surveys, human development surveys. Other sources are primary sources. So we have built the data set, for instance, of MLAs and MPs. We have now at Ashoka University and at Sciences Po 70,000 biodata of Indian MLAs and MPs. Now we do not look only at the MLAs and MPs, but also at the candidates, those who have tried to be elected, who have been nominated by the party. So that spent a lot of time with research assistants in the field, collecting data and processing, cross-checking. At the end of the day, I'm absolutely certain, 100% certain that the data are reliable. And when there is a slight doubt, we just have a question mark, and therefore we don't say 100%, but we say it's 98% or 97%. But you can still think about the results. I mean, you can still consider the results are usable.
Thank you, Professor Jaffrelot. I have another question that you have pointed out in your lecture nicely the problem actually. But the remedial part you have not discussed.
Professor A.T. Khan, please unmute.
Yeah, I have another question that you have pointed out during your lecture several problems actually. The data reflects it, you get the picture actually. My point is that how can you give some solution so that this we can minority Indian Muslim can little upgrade themselves?
Yeah, well, the role of the social scientist is not to somewhat find solutions, but by identifying the problems, they can somewhat give some sense of direction for some solution. We have mentioned several already. Some of them are not very realistic, but still, I continue to think that positive discrimination would be a solution, and it's not realistic at the moment, but it's definitely something that would make sense. Education, whatever the way you get it, is the other priority, and that's why I always highlight this decline of the educated elite among Muslims. Now, how do you get this education in some adverse context? Well, there I would say self-help. Self-help, maybe the need of the unity, maybe probably needed more. You know, I'm always struck by the divisions within minorities. It's fascinating to think that, well, for some people, they will not be the casualties. They may be part of the community, but they think that they will get away with it. And they look at the poor as the real casualty. Well, unity among minorities is certainly a prerequisite for self-help. Unity between class, between castes, between sectarian groups. Some groups, be they Shias or Boras or Aga Khanis, may not consider that they are Muslims. They may think that they are different. Well, in terms of priorities, to realize that this is not the way they are seen from outside. So yeah, that's my little contribution.
Thank you very much, Professor Jaffrelot. I think this your suggestion. Can you give hidden manner to Dr. Matin so he can work for a little bit for improvisation of our minority Muslims actually?
Okay, with this, there is another question. With the idea, with the Mandir, many opposition parties are speaking the language of the Sangh. Is there a risk that Muslims will be abandoned by every party as Hindutva becomes the ideological baseline of politics?
Well, this is exactly the Israeli trajectory. Never forget that in the past, in Israel, there was a party, the Labour Party, and there was a leader, Mr. Rabin, who was for peace and for equality between Israelis. And gradually, this party has receded in the background. It used to be the dominant party. It was Gurion who was its leader. You can say it was somewhat secular, progressive. And gradually what happened? Gradually, under Sharon, especially, you saw the fear of the other, the fear of the Muslims, the Arabs, but also the fear of the neighbors, the fear of the Arabs around Israel, the fear of Iran, becoming so strong that there was no room left for peace between communities. The dominant discourse became the majoritarian discourse, a security-oriented discourse. And of course, politics played a role there, and polarization became the strategy of the Likud. And the Likud therefore set the tone. You became illegitimate if you wanted to speak to Palestinians. I think that may happen in India as well. there may be a time when nobody would dare to say that Hindutva is not Hinduism, Hindu nationalism is not Indian nationalism, because the fear of the other would have become so pervasive, the fear of Pakistan, the fear of Islam, that the only game in town will be some form of Hindutva politics. And if you do not indulge in this discourse, you're illegitimate. Now, that's exactly what we saw in so many countries where national populism is taking over. You know, you delegitimize the other, and they can't compete anymore. So they have only one way out: to become like the dominant party. Of course, it's a soft version of it, but it's only a variant of it. That may well be the trajectory of India. The alternative would be to shift from identity politics to socio-economic issues, to change the whole parameters, to shift from identity politics to interest-based politics. Whether the crisis that India is now experiencing will result in this shift, it's too early to say. But if identity politics remains the order of the day, it will be very difficult to have an alternative discourse to Hindutva politics, because nobody remembers that India used to be multicultural. Nobody remembers that there was a kind of syncretic politics has to be Hindutva oriented. And that's exactly what we saw in the case of Israel. And the fear of the other, security-oriented discourses are so commanding, so strong, you know, you can't resist that. Incidentally, it's also what we saw on the Pakistani side, you know, and that's why Pakistan and Israel are so similar. Pakistan was so much afraid of India that at the end of the day, there was no dissenting voice that would be possible. And the politics was again made of Islamization. Yeah, that may be the Indian trajectory as well.
Okay, there is another question, almost same. What triggers the systematic othering of Muslims? I mean, is it the mere religious extremisms led by BJP, or the opposition, or is it the nihilistic threat to the very existence of the Muslim survival, the threat triggered by BJP?
Well, I think there is a much less complicated response to offer there. Electoral competition. How do you win elections? By polarizing. How do you polarize? By making the other a threat. I mean, by describing the other as posing a threat to your identity. So certainly there is a psychological dimension. Certainly there is a traditional sense of vulnerability among Hindus, and that was exacerbated at the turn of the 20th century, and the Khilafat movement subsequently resulted in the making of RSS. But everything gained momentum many decades later, when it became an electoral instrument, when you could mobilize voters by polarizing. So you could polarize in many different ways to mobilize people in the name of the Ayodhya issue was one of them. To trigger riots was another one. We do know that BGP does. But whatever the device, whatever the way they operated, it was power-oriented. It was primarily an electoral strategy, and it worked.
Thank you, Professor Jaffrelot. I'm back. I'm sorry, my computer hanged. So we are almost 5 minutes we have till 8 p.m. So there are many more questions, but what I will do is I will read 3-4 questions, and then maybe you can give the final ending note. So
all right.
So I'm reading. So one Sheikh Abid has asked, Hindu-Muslim bias in Indian constitution is real. So can SC, ST, OBC Muslim assertion, SC, ST, OBC Muslim assertion through linguistic nationalism challenge it? That's Abid question. Then just a second. Then there is one question on Muslim leadership. Alok Ranjan, he says that there is crisis of Muslim leadership. Where do you see the anti-CA mobilization in the context? There is one question by Mursid Alam. I just saw, just a second. Yeah, Mursid Alam. Do you see any possibility of Dalit Muslim alliance? Many political commentators are saying that OBC and Dalits are becoming pro-Hindutva recently. What is your view on this? And my question was cut short, so because you referred to this again, so I'm coming back to my question. You have mentioned many times that how educated elites among Muslims, the numbers have reduced. However, we saw, like in the last decade or so, what we have observed is, like say in a state like Bengal, even in Kerala and other parts, there's been an emergence of new middle class among Muslims who may not have political power as much, and in that sense they are not elite, but they are very vocal. And we saw the whole anti-CA protest being led by this new middle class. In fact, the BASE group is the one manifestation of that new middle class in Bengal. So how do you compare this new middle class to the traditional elite? So I think there is one question on women. So we have largely missed the women question. So this I am taking. This is by Rosona Khatun. How do you see the importance of Muslim women's education and empowerment in today's India?
Well,
I think these are 3-4. I think there are more questions, but I think with these you can wind up. Thank you so much.
I'll try to do justice to them, and then we'll close. Well, linguistic nationalism does not need to be enshrined only in SC, ST, OBC, and Muslims. It's a reality that will certainly make the expansion of BGP complicated in some parts of the country. But I would not work in Tamil Nadu. It will probably work in Kerala. But, you know, the way Hindutva has become the new identity of for so many people, including former communists, is fascinating. It shows that even West Bengal, we saw that in Assam, can be conquered by this ideology. So linguistic nationalism may not be sufficiently strong for resisting religious nationalism. This idea that Dalit Muslim alliance can be the antidote. You know, if socio-economic issues stage a comeback, and they may because the situation is very bad economically, but so for the moment they've not. And I think one of the reasons why Dalit and Muslims have not been so closely associated politically is largely due to two things. One, BGP was very good at using the Sanskritization mechanisms for attracting Dalits. 2, reservations are paradoxical mechanisms. In most of the states, few Dalit subcastes have cornered most of the quotas. Just one example, Jatavs in Uttar Pradesh have cornered most of the SC quotas, alienating small Dalit Jatis, Valmikis, Kattiks, and so on. BGP has been very good at attracting these groups which are so resentful vis-à-vis BSP, vis-à-vis the parties representing the winners of reservations. Well, that's a very important point. The poorest Dalits are behind BGP today. And to make an alliance with the Muslims is not on their agenda at the moment. So there are many reasons why, in terms of identity, but also in terms of interest, many Dalits will not join hands with Muslims. But I repeat, if a social crisis gains momentum, and if socioeconomic criteria, the new middle class among Muslims, yes. And in fact, I was about to mention this when you spoke about Muslim leadership regarding the CA. I think the CA agitation for me was very revealing of the emergence, crystallization of a middle class that had been rather apolitical till then. Executives, people of the salariat had not indulged in politics so far to the same extent. And the CA agitation showed that they were prepared to demonstrate, to go to the street. And that's probably the most important development. Interestingly, this is a development TV channels have not realized. They continue to invite mullahs for the talk shows, but they should now see that there are other spokespersons for the community and people from the middle class indeed. Among them, and that will be the last word, but a very important one, women have played an amazing part. In this anti-CA agitation, we've seen young Muslim women at the forefront of the agitation, not only young, all kinds of women. And as you could see on my tables, the level of education of women on the Muslim side is not bad at all. And it is in stark contrast with the stereotype of the Muslim woman that is burqa clad and so on and so forth. So yes, this is the ray of hope. Definitely this is a recent development, the politicization of a Muslim middle class that may help not only politically, but also socially. Because as I said, unity along class lines, along caste lines, along all kinds of lines is key. And it may become much more obvious now because there is hardly any way out. What else can be done at the kind of juncture we have reached? So yeah, we can end on this positive note before the next West Bengal election for 2020.
Thank you, Professor. Maybe before the election, we should request you for another lecture.
Why not?
I now invite Professor Amjad Hussain to give his concluding remark before we end finally. Sir, unmute korte hobe.
Yes, after the absorbing lecture, another very absorbing, very interesting Q&A session. Thank you, Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, very much for giving so much time from your busy schedule, as people used to say. But indeed, you have done us a lot of favor by almost talking for, I think, more than 1.5 hours. Thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future again. I think before the Bengal election in 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I invite Nargis ma'am to give the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Riyaz sir. Assalamu alaikum and good evening to all of you present here. At first, I would like to thank BASE for giving me the opportunity to deliver vote of thanks today. On behalf of BASE, Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment, I would like to extend my cordial and heartfelt thanks to our esteemed and honorable speaker today, Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, Professor Seri, and Research Director CNRS, Sciences Po, Paris, France.
Madam, please unmute yourself. Madam, please unmute yourself. Nargis, madam.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Thank you, sir. So, Assalamu alaikum and good evening to all of you present here. At first, I would like to thank BASE for giving me the opportunity to deliver vote of thanks today. On behalf of BASE, Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment, I would like to extend my cordial and heartfelt thanks to our today's honorable speaker, Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, Professor Seri, and Research Director CNRS, Sciences Po, Paris, France. It is a great opportunity, sir, to have you here in this platform and hear from you. We are really privileged to get you here, sir. Thank you for your deliberation for BASE lecture series today. And on behalf of BASE, I think you must deserve a French thank you. So I must say, merci beaucoup. So thank you so much. I would also like to thank Senior Professor Dr. Amzad Hussain, Dean of Students Affairs, Senior Professor of Department of English, Alia University, Kolkata, to chair today's session well. Thank you, sir. We are really glad to have you here also today with us. So I must thank BASE President, Vice President, GS, and all members night, now more or less every day, to make BASE lecture series happening successfully. Last but not the least, I thank deep from my heart to our wonderful audience who joined BASE lecture series throughout the country, and I think beyond the country also, and who always express their interest in lecture series constantly, which motivate us for working more hard towards a noble cause to disseminate knowledge. Thanks to the Professor Eti Khan as well as the eminent personalities who joined today's lecture also. There were overwhelmed response from our audience today for Professor Christophe Jaffrelot's lecture. So thank you all. Please join us. There is an announcement for our participant. Please join us our next lecture series number 28 by Dr. Chandriya Gopani from Allahabad University. The concept of Bahujan, which will take place on 10th August, 7:30 p.m. onwards. So thank you all once again, and thank you, Professor Jaffrelot.
Professor Jaffrelot, more than 240 participants attended your lecture.
Great. Congratulations.
Okay,
thank you. Please do send me the link.
Sure.
I will send it to my Twitter account.
Sure, sir. I will do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Good evening.
Thank you, sir. I thought Nargis ma'am will invite us for high tea.